Chapter 15. Nightmare Carousel. Totally let your kids ride. I'm sure they'll be fine. Nice night for a hike, Lavinia said. The sad thing was, I think she meant it. By that point, we'd been trekking through the Berkeley Hills for over an hour. Despite the cool weather, I was dripping with sweat and gasping for breath. Why did hilltops have to be uphill? Lavinia wasn't satisfied with sticking to the valleys either. Oh no, she wanted to conquer every summit for no apparent reason. Like fools, we followed her. We had crossed the borders of Camp Jupiter without a problem. Terminus hadn't even popped up to check our passports. So far, we had not been accosted by ghouls or panhandling fawns. The scenery was pleasant enough. The trail wound through sweet-smelling sage and bay trees. To our left, silver, luminescent fog blanketed the San Francisco Bay. Before us, the hills formed an archipelago of darkness in the ocean of city lights. Regional parks and nature reserves kept the area mostly wild, Lavinia explained. Just be on the lookout for mountain lions, she said. They're all over those hills. We're going to face the undead, I said, and you're warning us about mountain lions. Lavinia shot me a look that like, dude. She was right, of course. With my luck, I would probably come all this way, fighting monsters and evil emperors, only to get killed by an overgrown house cat. How much further, I asked. Not this again, Lavinia said. You aren't even carrying a coffin this time. We're about halfway there. Halfway? And we couldn't have taken a car or a giant eagle or an elephant. Hazel patted me on the shoulder. Relax, Apollo. Sneaking up on foot draws less attention. Besides, this is an easy quest. Most of mine have been like, go to Alaska and fight literally everything along the way, or sail halfway across the world and be seasick for months. This is just go over that hill and check on a merry-go-round. A zombie-infested merry-go-round, I corrected, and we've been over several hills. Hazel glanced at Meg. Does he always complain this much? He used to be a lot whinier. Hazel whistled softly. I know, Meg agreed. Big baby. I beg your pardon, I said. Shh, Lavinia said, before blowing and popping a giant pink bubble. Stealth, remember? We continued along the trail for another hour or so. As we passed a silver lake nestled between the hills, I couldn't help thinking it was just the sort of place my sister would love. Oh, how I wish she would appear with her hunters. Despite our differences, Artemis understood me. Well, okay, she tolerated me, most of the time. All right, some of the time. I longed to see her beautiful, annoying face again. That's how lonely and pathetic I had become. Meg walked a few yards ahead of me, flanking Lavinia so they could share bubblegum and talk unicorns. Hazel walked beside me, though I got the feeling she was mostly trying to make sure I didn't collapse. You don't look so good, she noted. What gave it away? The cold sweat? The rapid breathing? In the darkness, Hazel's gold eyes reminded me of an owl's, supremely alert, ready to fly or pounce as needed. How's the gut wound? Better, I said, though I was having more and more trouble convincing myself. Hazel redid her ponytail, but it was a losing battle. Her hair was so long, curly and luxuriant, it kept escaping its scrunchie. Just no more cuts, all right? Is there anything else you can tell me about Tarquin? Weaknesses? Blind spots? Pet peeves? Don't they teach you Roman history as part of Legion training? Well, yes, but I may have tuned out during the lectures. I went to Catholic school back in New Orleans in the 1930s. I have a lot of experience in tuning out teachers. I can relate. Socrates, very smart, but his discussion groups, not exactly riveting entertainment. So, Tarquin. Right, he was power-mad, arrogant, violent, would kill anyone who got in his way, like the emperors. But without any of their refinement. Tarquin was also obsessed with building projects. He started the Temple of Jupiter, also Rome's main sewer. Claim to fame. His subjects finally got so weary of taxes and forced labour that they rebelled. They didn't like digging a sewer. Can't imagine why. It occurred to me that Hazel wasn't so much interested in information as she was in distracting me from my worries. I appreciated that, but I had trouble returning her smile. I kept thinking about Tarquin's voice, speaking through the ghoul in the tunnel. He had known Hazel's name. He had promised her a special place among his undead horde. Tarquin is sly, I said. Like any true psychopath, he has always been good at manipulating people. As for weaknesses, I don't know. His relentlessness, maybe. Even after he got kicked out of Rome, he never stopped trying to win back the crown. He kept gathering new allies, attacking the city over and over again, even when it was clear he didn't have the strength to win. Apparently he still hasn't given up. Hazel pushed a eucalyptus branch out of our way. Well, we'll stick to the plan. Get in quietly, investigate, and leave. At least Frank is safe back at camp. Because you value his life more than ours? No. Well, you can leave it at no. Hazel shrugged. It's just that Frank seems to be looking for danger these days. I don't suppose he told you what he did at the Battle of the New Moon. He said the battle turned at the little Tiber. Zombies don't like running water. Frank turned the tide of battle, almost single-handedly. Demigods were falling all around him. He just kept fighting, shape-shifting into a giant snake, then a dragon, then a hippopotamus. She shuddered. He makes a terrifying hippo. By the time Raina and I managed to bring up reinforcements, the enemy was already in retreat. Frank had no fear. Her voice tightened. I don't want to lose him, especially after what happened to Jason. I tried to reconcile Hazel's story of Frank Zhang, fearless hippo-killing machine, with the easygoing big cuddly praetor who slept in a yellow silk pyjama shirt decorated with eagles and bears. I remembered the casual way he'd flipped his stick of firewood. He'd assured me he hadn't had a death wish. Then again, neither had Jason Grace. I don't intend to lose anyone else, I told Hazel. I stopped short of making a promise. The goddess of the river Styx had excoriated me for many broken oaths. She warned that everyone around me would pay for my crimes. Lupa, too, had foreseen more blood and sacrifice. How could I promise Hazel that any of us would be safe? Lavinia and Meg halted so abruptly I almost ran into them. See? Lavinia pointed through a break in the trees. We're almost there. In the valley below, an empty parking lot and picnic area occupied a clearing in the redwoods. At the far end of the meadow, silent and still, stood a carousel, all its lights blazing. Why is it lit up? I wondered. Maybe it is somebody's home, said Hazel. I like merry-go-rounds, said Meg, as she started down the path. The carousel was topped by a tan-coloured dome like a giant pith helmet. Behind a barricade of teal and yellow metal railings, the ride blazed with hundreds of lights. The painted animals threw long, distorted shadows across the grass. The horses looked frozen in panic, their eyes wild, their forelegs kicking. A zebra's head was raised, as if in agony. A giant rooster flared its red comb and stretched its talons. There was even a hippocampus, like Tyson's friend Rainbow, but this fish pony had a snarling face. What sort of parents would let their children ride such a nightmarish creature? Maybe Zeus, I thought. We approached cautiously, but nothing challenged us, neither living nor dead. The place seemed empty, just inexplicably lit up. Meg's glowing swords made the grass shimmer at her feet. Lavinia held her manuballista, primed and ready. With her pink hair and gangly limbs, she stood the best chance of sneaking up on the carousel animals and blending in with them, but I decided not to share that observation, as it would no doubt get me shot. Hazel left her sword in its sheath. Even empty-handed, she radiated a more intimidating demeanour than any of us. I wondered if I should pull out my bow. Then I looked down and realised I had instinctively readied my combat ukulele. OK, I could provide a jolly tune if we found ourselves in battle. Did that count as heroism? Something's not right, Lavinia murmured. You think? Meg crouched. She put down one of her swords and touched the grass with her fingertips. Her hand sent a ripple across the lawn like a stone thrown in water. Something's wrong with the soil here, she announced. The roots don't want to grow too deep. Hazel arched her eyebrows. You can talk to plants? It's not really talking, Meg said. But yeah, even the trees don't like this place. They're trying to grow away from that carousel as fast as they can. Which, since they're trees, I said, is not very fast. Hazel studied our surroundings. Let's see what I can find out. She knelt at the edge of the carousel's base and pressed her palm against the concrete. There were no visible ripples, no rumbling or shaking, but after a count of 3, Hazel snatched her hand away. She staggered backwards, almost falling over Lavinia. Gods! Hazel's whole body trembled. There's a massive complex of tunnels under here. My mouth went dry. Part of the labyrinth? No, I don't think so. It feels self-contained. The structure is ancient, but it also hasn't been here very long. I know that doesn't make sense. It does, I said, if the tomb relocated. Or regrew, Meg offered, like a tree clipping or a fungal spore. Gross, said Lavinia. Hazel hugged her elbows. The place is full of death. I mean, I'm a child of Pluto. I've been to the underworld, but this is worse somehow. I don't love that, Lavinia muttered. I looked down at my ukulele, wishing I'd brought a bigger instrument to hide behind. A double bass, perhaps. How do we get in? I hoped the answer would be, gosh darn it, we can't. There. Hazel pointed to a section of concrete that looked no different from the rest. We followed her over. She ran her fingers across the dark surface, leaving glowing silver grooves that outlined a rectangular slab the size of a coffin. Oh, why did I have to make that particular analogy? Her hand hovered over the middle of the rectangle. I think I'm supposed to write something here. A combination, maybe? To open his door, Lavinia recalled. 254. Wait, I fought down a wave of panic. There are lots of ways to write 254. Hazel nodded. Roman numerals, then? Yes, but 254 would be written differently in Roman numerals than 254, which is different from 2 and 54. Which is it then? Meg asked. I tried to think. Tarquin would have a reason to choose that number. He'd make it about himself. Lavinia popped a small, stealthy pink bubble. Like using your birthday for your password? Exactly, I said. But he wouldn't use his birthday, not for his tomb. Perhaps his date of death. Except that can't be right. No one's sure when he died, since he was in exile and buried in secret. But it had to have been around 495 BCE, not 254. Wrong date system, Meg said. We all stared at her. What? She demanded. I got raised in an evil emperor's palace. We dated everything from the founding of Rome. AUC. Ab Urba Candida, right? My gods, I said. Good catch, Meg. 254 AUC would be, let's see, 500 BCE. That's pretty close to 495. Hazel's fingers still hesitated over the concrete. Close enough to risk it? Yes, I said, trying to channel my inner Frank Zhang confidence. Write it as a date. 254. CCLIV. Hazel did. The numbers glowed silver. The entire stone slab dissipated into smoke, revealing steps leading down into darkness. Okay then, Hazel said. Have a feeling the next part is going to be harder. Follow me. Step only where I step, and don't make any noise. Chapter 16. Meet the new Tarquin. Same as the old Tarquin, but with a lot less flesh. So, no jolly tunes on the ukulele then. Fine. I silently followed Hazel down the steps into the Merigo tomb. As we descended, I wondered why Tarquin had chosen to reside under a carousel. He had watched his wife run over her own father in a chariot. Perhaps he liked the idea of an endless ring of horses and monsters circling above his resting place, keeping guard with their fierce faces, even if they were ridden mostly by mortal toddlers, who, I suppose, were fierce in their own way. Tarquin had a brutal sense of humour. He enjoyed tearing families apart, turning their joy into anguish. He was not above using children as human shields. No doubt he found it amusing to place his tomb under a brightly coloured kiddie ride. My ankles wobbled in terror. I reminded myself there was a reason I was climbing into this murderer's lair. I couldn't remember what that reason was at that moment, but there had to be one. The steps ended in a long corridor, its limestone walls decorated with rows of plaster death masks. At first, this did not strike me as odd. Most wealthy Romans kept a collection of death masks to honour their ancestors. Then I noticed the masks' expressions, like the carousel animals above. The plaster faces were frozen in panic, agony, rage, terror. These were not tributes, they were trophies. I glanced back at Meg and Lavinia. Meg stood at the base of the stairs, blocking any possible retreat. The glittery unicorn on her t-shirt grinned at me hideously. Lavinia met my eyes as if to say, yes, those masks are messed up. Now, keep going. We followed Hazel down the corridor, every clink and rustle of our weapons echoing against the barrel ceiling. I was sure the Berkeley Seismology Lab, several miles away, would pick up my heartbeat on their seismographs and send out earthquake early warnings. The tunnel split several times, but Hazel always seemed to know which direction to take. Occasionally she'd stop, look back at us and point urgently to some part of the floor, reminding us not to stray from her path. I didn't know what would happen if I took a wrong step, but I had no desire to have my death mask added to Tarquin's collection. After what seemed like hours, I began to hear water dripping somewhere in front of us. The tunnel opened into a circular room like a large cistern. The floor, nothing but a narrow stone path across a deep, dark pool. Hooked on the far wall were half a dozen wicker boxes like lobster traps, each with a circular opening at the bottom, just the right size for... Oh, gods! Each box was the right size to be fitted over a person's head. A tiny whimper escaped my mouth. Hazel glanced back and mouthed, "What?" A half-remembered story floated up from the sludge of my brain, how Tarquin had executed one of his enemies by drowning him in a sacred pool, binding the man's hands, placing a wicker cage over his head, then slowly adding rocks to the cage until the man could no longer keep his head above water. Apparently, Tarquin still enjoyed that particular form of entertainment. I shook my head. You don't want to know. Hazel, being wise, took my word for it. She led us onward. Just before the next chamber, Hazel held up a hand in warning. We halted. Following her gaze, I could make out two skeleton guards at the far side of the room, flanking an elaborately carved stone archway. The guards faced each other, wearing full war helmets, which was probably why they hadn't spotted us yet. If we made the slightest sound, if they glanced this way for any reason, we would be seen. About 70 feet separated us from their position. The floor of their chamber was littered with old human bones. No way could we sneak up on them. These were skeleton warriors, the special forces of the undead world. I had zero desire to fight them. I shivered, wondering who they had been before the Uranomai stripped them to the bone. I met Hazel's eyes, then pointed back the way we'd come. Retreat? She shook her head. Wait. Hazel shut her eyes in concentration. A bead of sweat trickled down the side of her face. The two guards snapped to attention. They turned away from us, facing the archway, then marched through side by side into the darkness. Lavinia's gum almost fell out of her mouth. How? She whispered. Hazel put her finger to her lips, then motioned for us to follow. The chamber was now empty except for the bones scattered across the floor. Perhaps the skeleton warriors came here to pick up spare parts. Along the opposite wall above the archway ran a balcony accessed by a staircase on either side. Its railing was a lattice work of contorted human skeletons, which did not freak me out at all. 2 doorways led off from the balcony, except for the main archway, through which our skeleton friends had marched. Those seemed to be the only exits from the chamber. Hazel led us up the left-hand staircase. Then, for reasons known only to herself, she crossed the balcony and took the doorway on the right. We followed her through. At the end of a short corridor, about 20 feet ahead, firelight illuminated another balcony with a skeletal railing, the mirror image of the one we'd just left. I couldn't see much of the chamber beyond it, but the space was clearly occupied. A deep voice echoed from within, a voice I recognised. Meg flicked her wrists, retracting her swords into rings, not because we were out of danger, but because she understood that even a little extra glow might give away our position. Lavinia tugged an oilcloth from her back pocket and draped it over her manuballista. Hazel gave me a look of warning that was completely unnecessary. I knew what lay just ahead. Tarquin, the Proud, was holding court. I crouched behind the balcony skeletal latticework and peered into the throne room below, desperately hoping none of the undead would look up and see us. Or smell us. Oh, human body odour, why did you have to be so pungent after several hours of hiking? Against the far wall, between 2 massive stone pillars, sat a sarcophagus, chiselled with bas-relief images of monsters and wild animals, much like the creatures on the Tilden Park carousel. Lounging across the sarcophagus lid was the thing that had once been Tarquinius Superbus. His robes had not been laundered in several thousand years. They hung off him in mouldering shreds. His body had withered to a blackened skeleton. Patches of moss clung to his jawbone and cranium, giving him a grotesque beard and hairdo. Tendrils of glowing purple gas slithered through his ribcage and circled his joints, coiling up his neck and onto his skull, lighting his eye sockets fiery violet. Whatever that purple light was, it seemed to be holding Tarquin together. It probably wasn't his soul. I doubted Tarquin had ever had one of those. More likely it was his sheer ambition and hatred, a stubborn refusal to give up, no matter how long he'd been dead. The king seemed to be in the middle of scolding the 2 skeleton guards Hazel had manipulated. "Did I call you?" demanded the king. "No, I did not. So why are you here?" The skeletons looked at each other as if wondering the same thing. "Get back to your posts," Tarquin shouted. The guards marched back the way they had come. This left 3 Uranomai and half a dozen zombies milling around in the room, though I got the feeling there might be more directly beneath our balcony. Even worse, the zombies, Vaikolakai, whatever you wanted to call them, were former Roman legionnaires. Most were still dressed for battle in dented armour and torn clothing, their skin puffy, their lips blue, gaping wounds in their chests and limbs. The pain in my gut became almost intolerable. The words from the Burning Maze prophecy were stuck on replay in my mind. Apollo faces death. Apollo faces death. Next to me, Lavinia trembled, her eyes tearing up. Her gaze was fixed on one of the dead legionnaires, a young man with long brown hair, the left side of his face badly burned. A former friend, I guessed. Hazel gripped Lavinia's shoulder, perhaps to comfort her, perhaps to remind her to be silent. Meg knelt at my other side, her glasses glinting. I desperately wished I had a permanent marker to black out her rhinestones. She seemed to be counting enemies, calculating how far she could take them all down. I had great faith in Meg's sword skills, at least when she wasn't exhausted from bending eucalyptus trees. But I also knew these enemies were too many, too powerful. I touched her knee for attention. I shook my head and tapped my ear, reminding her that we were here to spy, not to fight. She stuck out her tongue. We were simpatico, like that. Below, Tarquin grumbled something about not being able to find good help. "Anyone seen Caelus? Where is he? Caelus!" A moment later, A Euronymous shuffled in from a side tunnel. He knelt before the king and screamed, "Eat flesh soon!" Tarquin hissed, "Caelius, we've discussed this. Keep your wits." Caelius slapped himself in the face. "Yes, my king." His voice now had a measured British accent. "Terribly sorry. The fleet is on schedule. It should arrive in 3 days, just in time for the blood moon's rising." "Very well. And our own troops?" "Eat flesh!" Caelius slapped himself again. "Apologies, sire. Yes, everything is ready. The Romans suspect nothing. As they turn outward to face the emperors, we will strike." "Good. It is imperative we take the city first. When the emperors arrive, I want to be already in control. They can burn the rest of the Bay Area if they wish, but the city is mine." Meg clenched her fists until they turned the colour of the bone latticework. After our experiences with the heat-distressed dryads of Southern California, she had got a little touchy whenever evil megalomaniacs threatened to torch the environment. I gave her my most serious stay cool glare, but she wouldn't look at me. Down below, Tarquin was saying, "And the silent one?" "He is well guarded, sire," Caelius promised. Tarquin mused. "Double the flock. Nevertheless, we must be sure." "But, my king, surely the Romans cannot know about Sutra—" "Silence!" Tarquin ordered. Caelius whimpered. "Yes, my king. Flesh. Sorry, my king. Eat flesh." Tarquin raised his glowing purple skull towards our balcony. I prayed that he hadn't noticed us. Lavinia stopped chewing her gum. Hazel looked deep in concentration, perhaps willing the undead king to look away. After a count of 10, Tarquin chuckled. "Well, Caelius, it looks like you'll get to eat flesh sooner than I thought. Master, we have interlopers." Tarquin raised his voice. "Come down, you four, and meet your new king." Chapter 17. "Meg, don't you dare." "Meg? Or you could just get us killed. Yeah, sure, that works too." I hope there were 4 other interlopers hidden somewhere on this balcony. Surely Tarquin was talking to them and not us. Hazel jabbed her thumb towards the exit, the universal sign for "Let's vamoose." Lavinia began crawling that way on her hands and knees. I was about to follow when Meg ruined everything. She stood up tall, well, as tall as Meg can be, summoned her swords and leapt over the railing. "Meg!" I shouted, half war cry, half "What in Hades are you doing?" Without any conscious decision, I was on my feet, my bow in hand. An arrow knocked and loosed, then another and another. Hazel muttered a curse no proper lady from the 1930s should have known, drew her cavalry sword and jumped into the fray so Meg would not have to stand alone. Lavinia rose, struggling to uncover her manuballista, but the oilcloth seemed to be stuck on the crossbeam. More undead swarmed at Meg from under the balcony. Her twin swords whirled and flashed, cutting off limbs and heads, reducing zombies to dust. Hazel decapitated Caelius, then turned to face another 2 Euronymii. The deceased former legionnaire, with a burned face, would have stabbed Hazel in the back, but Lavinia loosed her crossbow just in time. The imperial gold bolt hit the zombie between the shoulder blades, causing him to implode in a pile of armour and clothes. "Sorry, Bobby," Lavinia said with a sob. I made a mental note never to tell Hannibal how his former trainer had met his end. I kept firing until only the arrow of Dodona remained in my quiver. In retrospect, I realised I'd fired a dozen arrows in about 30 seconds, each a kill shot. My fingers literally steamed. I hadn't unleashed a volley like that since I was a god. This should have delighted me, but any feeling of satisfaction was cut short by Tarquin's laughter. As Hazel and Meg cut down the last of his minions, he rose from his sarcophagus couch and gave us a round of applause. Nothing sounds more sinister than the ironic, slow clap of 2 skeletal hands. "Lovely," he said. "Oh, that was very nice. You'll all make valuable members of my team." Meg charged. The king didn't touch her butt. With a flick of his hand, some invisible force sent Meg flying backwards into the far wall. Her swords clattered to the floor. A guttural sound escaped my throat. I leapt over the railing, landing on one of my own spent arrow shafts, which are every bit as treacherous as banana peels. I slipped and fell hard on my hip. Not my most heroic entrance. Meanwhile, Hazel ran at Tarquin. She was hurled aside with another blast of unseen force. Tarquin's hearty chuckle filled the chamber. From the corridors on either side of his sarcophagus, the sounds of shuffling feet and clanking armour echoed, getting closer and closer. Up on the balcony, Lavinia furiously cranked her manuballista. If I could buy her another 20 minutes or so, she might be able to take a second shot. "Well, Apollo," said Tarquin, purple coils of mist slithering from his eye sockets and into his mouth. "Yuck. Neither of us have aged well, have we?" My heart pounded. I groped around for usable arrows, but found only more broken shafts. I was half tempted to shoot the arrow of Dodona, but I couldn't risk giving Tarquin a weapon with prophetic knowledge. Can talking arrows be tortured? I didn't want to find out. Meg struggled to her feet. She looked unhurt but grumpy, as she tended to whenever she got thrown into walls. I imagine she was thinking the same thing as me. This situation was too familiar, too much like Caligula's yacht when Meg and Jason had been imprisoned by Venti. I couldn't let another scenario like that play out. I was tired of evil monarchs tossing us around like ragdolls. Hazel was covered head to toe in zombie dust. That couldn't have been good for her respiratory system. In the back of my mind, I wondered if we could get Justitia, the Roman law goddess, to file a class action suit on our behalf against Tarquin for hazardous tomb conditions. "Everyone," Hazel said, "back up." It was the same thing she told us in the tunnel to camp, right before turning the Euronymous into sealing art. Tarquin just laughed. "Ah, Hazel Levesque, your clever tricks with rocks won't work here. This is my seat of power. My reinforcements will arrive any moment. It will be easier if you don't resist your deaths. I'm told it's less painful that way." Above me, Lavinia continued to crank her hand cannon. Meg picked up her swords. "Fight or run, guys." The way she glared at Tarquin, I was pretty sure I knew her preference. "Oh, child," Tarquin said. "You can try to run, but soon enough you'll be fighting at my side with those wonderful blades of yours. As for Apollo, he's not going anywhere." He curled his fingers. He was nowhere close to me, but my gut wound convulsed, sending hot skewers into my ribcage and groin. I screamed, my eyes welled with tears. "Stop it!" Lavinia shrieked. She dropped from the balcony and landed at my side. "What are you doing to him?" Meg charged again at the undead king, perhaps hoping to catch him off guard. Without even looking at her, Tarquin tossed her aside with another blast of force. Hazel stood as stiff as a limestone column, her eyes fixed on the wall behind the king. Tiny cracks had begun to spiderweb across the stone. "Why, Lavinia," the king said, "I'm calling Apollo home." He grinned, which was the only facial expression he was capable of, having no face. "Poor Lester would have been compelled to seek me out eventually, once the poison took hold of his brain. But getting him here so soon, this is a special treat." He clenched his bony fist tighter. My pain tripled. I groaned and blubbered. My vision swam in red Vaseline. How was it possible to feel so much pain and not die? "Leave him alone," yelled Meg. From the tunnels on either side of Tarquin's sarcophagus, more zombies began to spill into the room. "Run," I gasped. "Get out of here." I now understood the lines from the burning maze. I would face death in Tarquin's tomb, or a fate worse than death, but I would not allow my friends to perish too. Stubbornly, annoyingly, they refused to leave. "Apollo is my servant now, Meg McCaffrey," Tarquin said. "You really shouldn't mourn him. He's terrible to the people he loves. You can ask the Sibyl." The king regarded me as I writhed like an insect pinned to a corkboard. "I hope the Sibyl lasts long enough to see you humbled. That may be what finally breaks her. And then those bumbling emperors arrive. They will see the true terror of a Roman king." Hazel howled. The back wall collapsed, bringing down half the ceiling. Tarquin and his troops disappeared under the avalanche of rocks the size of assault vehicles. My pain subsided to mere agony levels. Lavinia and Meg hauled me to my feet. Angry purple lines of infection now twisted up my arms. That probably wasn't good. Hazel hobbled over. Her corneas had turned an unhealthy shade of grey. "We need to move." Lavinia glanced at the pile of rubble. "But isn't he—" "Not dead," Hazel said with a bitter disappointment. "I can feel him squirming under there, trying to—" She shivered. "It doesn't matter. More undead will be coming. Let's go." Easier said than done. Hazel limped along, breathing heavily as she led us back through a different set of tunnels. Meg guarded our retreat, slicing down the occasional zombie that stumbled across our path. Lavinia had to support most of my weight, but she was deceptively strong, just as she was deceptively nimble. She seemed to have no trouble hauling my sorry carcass through the tomb. I was only semi-conscious of my surroundings. My bow clanged against my ukulele, making a jarring, open chord in perfect sync with my rattled brain. What had just happened? After that beautiful moment of godlike prowess with my bow, I'd suffered an ugly, perhaps terminal setback with my gut wound. I now had to admit I was not getting better. Tarquin had spoken of a poison slowly making its way to my brain. Despite the best efforts of the camp's healers, I was turning, becoming one of the king's creatures. By facing him, I had apparently accelerated the process. This should have terrified me. The fact that I could think about it with such detachment was itself concerning. The medical part of my mind decided I must be going into shock, or possibly just, dying. Hazel stopped at the intersection of two corridors. I'm not sure. What do you mean? Meg asked. Hazel's corneas were still the colour of wet clay. I can't get a read. There should be an exit here. We're close to the surface, but I'm sorry, guys. Meg retracted her blades. That's okay. Keep watch. What are you doing? Lavinia asked. Meg touched the nearest wall. The ceiling shifted and cracked. I had a fleeting image of us getting buried like Tarquin under several tons of rock, which, in my present state of mind, seemed like an amusing way to die. Instead, dozens of thickening tree roots wriggled their way through the cracks, pushing apart the stones. Even as a former god accustomed to magic, I found it mesmerizing. The roots spiraled and wove themselves together, shoving aside the earth, letting in the dim glow of moonlight, until we found ourselves at the base of a gently sloping chute. A root chute, with handholds and footholds for climbing. Meg sniffed the air above. Smells safe. Let's go. While Hazel stood guard, Meg and Lavinia joined forces to get me up the chute. Meg pulled, Lavinia pushed. It was all very undignified, but the thought of Lavinia's half-prime manuballista jostling around somewhere below my delicate posterior gave me an incentive to keep moving. We emerged at the base of a redwood in the middle of the forest. The carousel was nowhere in sight. Meg gave Hazel a hand up, then touched the trunk of the tree. The root chute spiraled shut, submerging under the grass. Hazel swayed on her feet. Where are we? This way, Lavinia announced. She shouldered my weight again, despite my protestations that I was fine. Really, I was only dying a little bit. We staggered down a trail among the looming redwoods. I couldn't see the stars or discern any landmarks. I had no idea in which direction we were heading, but Lavinia seemed undeterred. How do you know where we are? I asked. Told you, she said. I like to explore. She must really like poison oak, I thought for the umpteenth time. Then I wondered if Lavinia simply felt more at home in the wild than she did at camp. She and my sister would get along fine. Are any of you hurt? I asked. Did the ghouls scratch you? The girls all shook their heads. What about you? Meg scowled and pointed at my gut. I thought you were getting better. I guess I was too optimistic. I wanted to scold her for jumping into combat and nearly getting us all killed, but I didn't have the energy. Also, the way she was looking at me, I got the feeling that her grumpy facade might collapse into tears faster than Tarquin's ceilings had crumbled. Hazel eyed me warily. You should have healed. I don't understand. Lavinia, can I have some gum? I asked. Seriously? She dug in her pocket and handed me a piece. You're a corrupting influence. With leaden fingers, I managed to unwrap the gum and stick it into my mouth. The flavour was sickly sweet. It tasted pink. Still, it was better than the sour ghoul poison welling up in my throat. I chewed, glad of something to focus on beside the memory of Tarquin's skeletal fingers curling and sending sieves of fire through my intestines. And what he had said about the Sibyl. No, I couldn't process that right now. After a few hundred years of torturous hiking, we reached a small stream. We're close, Lavinia said. Hazel glanced behind us. I'm sensing maybe a dozen behind us closing fast. I saw and heard nothing, but I took Hazel's word for it. Go, you'll move faster without me. Not happening, Meg said. Here, take Apollo. Lavinia offered me to Meg, like I was a sack of groceries. You guys cross the stream. Go up that hill. You'll see Camp Jupiter. Meg straightened her grimy glasses. What about you? I'll draw them away. Lavinia patted her manuballista. That's a terrible idea, I said. It's what I do, Lavinia said. I wasn't sure if she meant drawing away enemies or executing terrible ideas. She's right, Hazel decided. Be careful, Legionnaire. We'll see you at camp. Lavinia nodded and darted into the woods. Are you sure that was wise? I asked Hazel. No, she admitted, but whatever Lavinia does, she always seems to come back unscathed. Now, let's get you home. Chapter 18. Cooking with Pranjal, Chickweed and Unicorn Horn, Slow-basted Zombie. Home. Such a wonderful word. I had no idea what it meant, but it sounded nice. Somewhere along the trail back to camp, my mind must have detached from my body. I don't remember passing out. I don't remember reaching the valley. But at some point my consciousness drifted away like an escaped helium balloon. I dreamed of homes. Had I ever really had one? Delos was my birthplace, but only because my pregnant mother Leto took refuge there to escape Hera's wrath. The island served as an emergency sanctuary for my sister and me too, but it never felt like home, any more than the back seat of a taxi would feel like home to a child born on the way to a hospital. Mount Olympus? I had a palace there. I visited for the holidays, but it always felt more like the place my dad lived with my stepmom. The Palace of the Sun? That was Helios's old crib. I'd just redecorated. Even Delphi, home of my greatest oracle, had originally been the lair of Python. Try as you might, you can never get the smell of old snakeskin out of a volcanic cavern. Sad to say, in my 4,000 plus years, the times I'd felt most at home had all happened during the past few months. At Camp Half-Blood, sharing a cabin with my demigod children. At the way station with Emma, Joe, Georgina, Leo and Calypso. All of us sitting around the kitchen table, chopping vegetables from the garden for dinner. At the cistern in Palm Springs with Meg, Grover, Melly, Coach Hedge and a prickly assortment of cactus dryads. And now at Camp Jupiter, where the anxious, grief-stricken Romans, despite their many problems, despite the fact that I brought misery and disaster wherever I went, had welcomed me with respect, a room above their coffee shop and some lively, lovely bed linen to wear. These places were homes. Whether I deserved to be part of them or not, that was a different question. I wanted to linger in those good memories. I suspected I might be dying, perhaps in a coma on the forest floor as ghoul poison spread through my veins. I wanted my last thoughts to be happy ones. My brain had different ideas. I found myself in the cavern of Delphi. Nearby, dragging himself through the darkness, wreathed in orange and yellow smoke, was the all too familiar shape of Python, like the world's largest and most rancid Komodo dragon. His smell was oppressively sour, a physical pressure that constricted my lungs and made my sinuses scream. His eyes cut through the sulphuric vapour like headlamps. You think it matters? Python's booming voice rattled my teeth. These little victories, you think they lead to something? I couldn't speak. My mouth still tasted like bubblegum. I was grateful for the sickly sweetness, a reminder that a world existed outside the cave of horrors. Python lumbered closer. I wanted to grab my bow, but my arms were paralysed. It was for nothing, he said. The deaths you caused, the deaths you will cause, they don't matter. If you win every battle, you will still lose the war. As usual, you don't understand the true stakes. Face me and you will die. He opened his vast maw, slavering reptilian lips, pulled over glistening teeth. Gah! My eyes flew open. My limbs flailed. Oh, good, said a voice. You're awake. I was lying on the floor inside some sort of wooden structure like a stable. The smells of hay and horse manure filled my nostrils. A Hessian blanket prickled against my back. Peering down at me were two unfamiliar faces. One belonged to a handsome young man with silky black hair cresting over his wide sepia forehead. The other face belonged to a unicorn. Its muzzle glistened with mucus. Its startled blue eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on me, as if I might be a tasty bag of oats. Stuck on the tip of its horn was a rotary cheese grater. Ugh, I said again. Calm down, dummy, Meg said, somewhere to my left. You're with friends. I couldn't see her. My peripheral vision was still blurry and pink. I pointed weakly at the unicorn. Cheese grater? Yes, said the lovely young man. It's the easiest way to get a dose of horn shavings directly into the wound. Buster doesn't mind. Do you, Buster? Buster the unicorn continued to stare at me. I wondered if he was even alive or just a prop unicorn they had wheeled in. My name's Pranjal, said the young man, head healer for the Legion. I worked on you when you first got here, but we didn't really meet then, since, well, you were unconscious. I'm a son of Asclepius. I guess that makes you my grandpa. I moaned. Please don't call me grandpa. I feel terrible enough already. Are all the others all right? Lavinia? Hazel? Meg hovered into view. Her glasses were clean, her hair was washed and her clothes were changed, so I must have been out for quite a while. We're all fine. Lavinia got back right after we did, but you almost died. She sounded annoyed, as if my death would have inconvenienced her greatly. You should have told me how bad that cut was. I assumed it would heal. Pranjal knitted his eyebrows. Yes, well, it should have. You got excellent care, if I do say so myself. We know about ghoul infections. They're usually curable, if we catch them within 24 hours. But you, Meg said, scowling at me, you aren't responding to treatment. That's not my fault. It could be your godly side, Pranjal mused. I've never had a patient who was a former immortal. That might make you resistant to demigod healing or more susceptible to undead scratches. I just don't know. I levered myself up on my elbows. I was bare-chested. My wound had been rebandaged, so I couldn't tell how bad it looked underneath. But the pain had subsided to a dull ache. Tendrils of purple infection still snaked from my belly, up my chest and down my arms, but their colour had faded to a faint lavender. Whatever you did obviously helped, I said. We'll see. Pranjal's frown was not encouraging. I tried a special concoction, a kind of magical equivalent to broad-spectrum antibiotics. It required a special strain of Stellaria media, magical chickweed, That doesn't grow in Northern California. It grows here now, Meg announced. Yes, Pranjal agreed with a smile. I may have to keep Meg around. She's pretty handy for growing medicinal plants. Meg blushed. Buster still hadn't moved or blinked. I hoped Pranjal occasionally put a spoon under the unicorn's nostrils to make sure he was breathing. At any rate, Pranjal continued, the salve I used wasn't a cure. It will only slow down your condition. My condition? What a wonderful euphemism for turning into a walking corpse. And if I do want a cure, I asked, which, by the way, I do, that's going to take more powerful healing than I'm capable of, he confessed. God-level healing. I felt like crying. I decided Pranjal needed to work on his bedside manner, perhaps by having a better collection of miraculous over-the-counter cures that did not require divine intervention. We could try more horn shavings, Meg suggested. That's fun. I mean, that might work. Between Meg's anxiousness to use the cheese grater and Buster's hungry stare, I was starting to feel like a plate of pasta. Don't suppose you have any leads on available healing gods? Actually, Pranjal said, if you're feeling up to it, you should get dressed and have Meg walk you to the Principia. Raina and Frank are anxious to talk to you. Meg took pity on me. Before meeting the Praters, she took me back to Bombillo's so I could wash and change my clothes. Afterwards, we stopped by the Legion Mess Hall for food. Judging from the angle of the sun and the near-empty dining room, I guessed it was late afternoon, between lunch and dinner, which meant I'd been unconscious for almost a full day. The day after tomorrow, then, would be the 8th of April. The blood moon, Lester's birthday, the day 2 evil emperors and an undead king attacked Camp Jupiter. On the bright side, the mess hall was serving fish fingers. When I was done with my meal, here's a culinary secret I discovered: ketchup really enhances fries and fish fingers. Meg escorted me down to the Via Praetoria to Legion headquarters. Most of the Romans seemed to be off doing whatever Romans did in the late afternoon. Marching, digging trenches, playing Fortunus Itinus. I wasn't really sure. The few legionnaires we passed stared at me as we walked by, their conversation sputtering to a stop. I guessed word had spread about our adventure in Tarquin's tomb. Perhaps they'd heard that I had a slight turning into a zombie problem, and they were waiting for me to scream for brains. The thought made me shudder. My gut wound felt so much better at the moment. I could walk without cringing. The sun was shining. I'd eaten a good meal. How could I still be poisoned? Denial is a powerful thing. Unfortunately, I suspected Pranjal was right. He had only slowed down the infection. My condition was beyond anything that camp healers, Greek or Roman, could solve. I needed godly help, which was something Zeus had expressly forbidden the other gods to give me. The guards at the Praetorium let us through immediately. Inside, Raina and Frank sat behind a long table laden with maps, books, daggers, and a large jar of jelly beans. Against the back wall, in front of a purple curtain, stood the Legion's golden eagle, humming with energy. Being so near to it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't know how the praetors could tolerate working here with that thing right behind them. Hadn't they read the medical journal articles about the effects of long-term exposure to the electromagnetic Roman standards? Frank appeared ready for battle in his full armour. Raina looked like she was the one who'd just woken up. She wore her purple cloak hastily pulled over a too large Puerto Rico Fuerte t-shirt, which I wondered if she'd slept in. But that was none of my business. The left side of her hair was an adorable fuzzy black mess of cowlicks that made me wonder if she slept on that side. And again, that was none of my business. Curled on the carpet at her feet were 2 automatons I hadn't seen before, a pair of greyhounds, one gold and one silver. They both raised their heads when they saw me, then sniffed the air and growled as if to say, "Hey Mum, this guy smells like zombie. Can we kill him?" Raina hushed them. She dug some jelly beans out of the jar and tossed them to the dogs. I wasn't sure why metallic greyhounds would like candy, but they snapped up the morsels, then settled their heads back on the carpet. Nice dogs," I said. "Why haven't I seen them before?" "Aurum and Argentum have been out searching," Raina said, in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. "How is your wound?" "My wound is thriving," I said. "Me, not so much." "He's better than before," Meg insisted. "I grated some unicorn horn shavings on his cut. It was fun." "Pranjal helped too," I said. Frank gestured at the 2 visitors' seats. "You guys make yourselves comfortable." Comfortable was a relative term. The 3-legged, foldable stools did not look as comfy as the praetors' chairs. They also reminded me of the Oracle's tripod seat in Delphi, which reminded me of Rachel Elizabeth Dare back at Camp Half-Blood, who was not so patiently waiting for me to restore her powers of prophecy. Thinking about her reminded me of the Delphic cave, which reminded me of Python, which reminded me of my nightmare and how scared I was of dying. I hate streams of consciousness. Once we were seated, Rayner spread a parchment scroll across the table. So, we've been working with Ella and Tyson since yesterday, trying to decipher some more lines of prophecy. We've made progress, Frank added. We think we found the recipe you were talking about at the Senate meeting, the ritual that could summon divine aid to save the camp. That's great, right? Meg reached for the jar of jelly beans, but retracted her hand when Aurum and Argentum began growling. Maybe. Rayner exchanged a worried look with Frank. The thing is, if we're reading the lines correctly, the ritual requires a death sacrifice. The fish fingers began sword fighting with the French fries in my stomach. That can't be right, I said. We gods would never ask you mortals to sacrifice one of your own. We gave that up centuries ago, or millennia ago, I can't remember, but I'm sure we gave it up. Frank gripped his armrests. Yeah, that's the thing. It's not a mortal who's supposed to die. No, Rayner locked eyes with me. It seems the ritual requires the death of a god. Chapter 19. Oh, book, what's my fate? What is the secret of life? See Appendix F. Why was everybody looking at me? I couldn't help it if I was the only ex-god in the room. Rayner leaned over the scroll, tracing her finger across the parchment. Frank copied these lines from Tyson's back. As you can probably guess, they read more like an instruction manual than a prophecy. I was about to crawl out of my skin. I wanted to rip the scroll away from Rayner and read the bad news myself. Was my name mentioned? Sacrificing me couldn't possibly please the gods, could it? If we Olympians started sacrificing one another, that would set a terrible precedent. Meg eyed the jar of jelly beans, while the greyhounds eyed her. Which god dies? Well, that particular line. Rayner squinted, then pushed the parchment over to Frank. What is that word? Frank looked sheepish. Shattered. Sorry, I was writing fast. No, it's fine. Your handwriting is better than mine. Can you please just tell me what it says? I begged. Right, sorry, Rayner said. Well, it's not exactly poetry, like the sonnet you got in Indianapolis. Rayner! Okay, it says, all to be done on the day of greatest need. Gather the ingredients for a Type 6 burnt offering. See Appendix B. We're doomed, I wailed. We'll never be able to collect those, whatever they are. That part's easy, Frank assured me. Ella has the list of ingredients. She says it's all ordinary stuff. He gestured for Rayner to continue. Add the last breath of the god who speaks not. Once his soul is cut free. Rayner read aloud, together with the shattered glass. Then the single deity summoning prayer, see Appendix C, must be uttered through the wet rainbow. She took a breath. We don't have the actual text of that prayer yet, but Ella is confident that she can transcribe it before the battle starts, now that she knows what to look for in Appendix C. Frank glanced at me for a reaction. Does the rest of it make any sense to you? I was so relieved I almost slumped off my three-legged stool. You got me all worked up. I thought, well, I have been called a lot of things, but never the god who speaks not. Sounds like we must find the soundless god, whom we've discussed before, and, kill him? Rayner asked. How would killing a god please the gods? I don't have an answer to that. Then again, many prophecies seemed illogical until they played out. Only in retrospect did they appear obvious. Perhaps if I knew which god we're talking about. I pounded my fist on my knee. I feel like I should know, but it's buried deep. An obscure memory. I don't suppose you've checked your libraries or run a Google search or something? Of course we looked, Frank said. There's no listing for a Roman or Greek god of silence. Roman or Greek? I felt sure I was missing something. Like part of my brain, for instance. Last breath. His soul is cut free. It definitely sounded like instructions for a sacrifice. I have to think on it, I decided. As for the rest of the instructions, shattered glass seems like an odd request, but I suppose we can find some easily enough. We could break the jelly bean jar, Meg suggested. Rayner and Frank politely ignored her. And the single deity summoning thing, Frank asked. I guess that means we won't be getting a host of gods charging down in their chariots. Probably not, I agreed. But my pulse quickened. The possibility of being able to speak to even one fellow Olympian after all this time, to summon actual grade AA quality jumbo cage-free, locally sourced divine help. I found the idea both exhilarating and terrifying. Would I get to choose which god I called, or was it predetermined by the prayer? Nevertheless, even one god can make all the difference. Meg shrugged. Depends on the god. That hurt, I said. What about the last line? Rayner asked. The prayer must be uttered through the rainbow. An iris message, I said. Happy I could answer one question at least. It's a Greek thing, a way of beseeching Iris, goddess of the rainbow, to carry a message, in this case a prayer to Mount Olympus. The formula is quite simple. But Frank frowned. Percy told me about Iris messages. They don't work anymore, do they? Not since all our communications went silent. Communications, I thought. Silent. The soundless god. I felt as if I'd fallen into the deep end of a very cold pool. Oh, I am so stupid. Meg giggled, but she resisted the many sarcastic comments that were no doubt filling her mind. I, in turn, resisted the urge to push her off her stool. This soundless god, whoever he is, what if he's the reason our communications don't work? What if the triumvirate has somehow been harnessing his power to prevent us all from talking to one another and to keep us from beseeching the gods for help? Raina crossed her arms, blocking out the word fuete on her t-shirt. You're saying what? This soundless god is in cahoots with the triumvirate. We have to kill him to open our means of communication. Then we could send an Iris message, do the ritual and get divine help. I'm still stuck on the whole killing a god thing. I considered the Eritrean Sibyl, whom we'd rescued from her prison in the burning maze. Perhaps this god isn't a willing participant. He might have been trapped or, I don't know, coerced somehow. So we free him by killing him? Frank asked. Gotta agree with Raina, that sounds harsh. One way to find out, Meg said. We go to this Sutro place. Can I feed your dogs? Without waiting for permission, she grabbed the jelly bean jar and popped it open. Aurum and Argentum, having heard the magic words feed and dogs, did not growl or tear Meg apart. They got up, moved to her side and sat watching her, their jewelled eyes sending the message, please, please, please. Meg doled out a jelly bean to each dog, then ate 2 herself. 2 for the dogs, 2 for herself. Meg had achieved a major diplomatic breakthrough. Meg's right. Sutro is the place Tarquin's minion mentioned, I recalled. Presumably, we'll find the soundless god there. Mount Sutro? Raina asked. Or Sutro Tower, did he say which? Frank raised an eyebrow. Isn't it the same place? I always just call that area Sutro Hill. Actually, the biggest hill is Mount Sutro, said Raina. The giant antenna is on a different hill right next to it. That's Sutro Tower. I only know this because Aurum and Argentum like to go hiking over there. The greyhounds turned their heads at the word hiking, then went back to studying Meg's hand in the jelly bean jar. I tried to imagine Raina hiking with her dogs just for fun. I wondered if Lavinia knew that was her pastime. Maybe Lavinia was such a dedicated hiker because she was trying to outdo the praetor, the same way she had her thinking spot high above Raina's. Then I decided that trying to psychoanalyse my pink-haired, tap-dancing, manuballista-wielding friend was probably a losing proposition. Is this Sutro place close? Meg was slowly deleting all the green jelly beans, which was giving her a different sort of green thumb. It's across the bay in San Francisco, Raina said. The tower is massive. You can see it from all over the Bay Area. Weird place to keep someone, Frank said, but I guess no weirder than under a carousel. I tried to remember if I'd ever seen or been to Sutro Tower, or any of the other various Sutro-labelled places in that vicinity. Nothing came to mind, but the instructions from the Sibylline books had left me deeply unsettled. The last breath of a god was not an ingredient most ancient Roman temples kept in their pantries, and cutting a god's soul free really was not something Romans were supposed to try without adult supervision. If the soundless god was part of the triumvirate scheme for control, why would Tarquin have access to him? What had Tarquin meant by doubling the flock to guard the god's location? And what he'd said about the Sibyl? I hope the Sibyl lasts long enough to see you humbled. That may be what finally breaks her. Had he just been messing with my mind? If the Sibyl of Cumae was truly still alive, a captive of Tarquin, I was obliged to help her. Help her. The cynical part of my mind responded, like you helped her before. Wherever the soundless god is, I said, he'll be heavily protected, especially now. Tarquin must know we'll try to locate the hiding place. And we have to do so on April the 8th, said Raina, the day of greatest need. Frank grunted. Good thing we don't have anything else scheduled that day, like getting invaded on 2 fronts, for instance. My gods, Meg, Raina said, you're going to make yourself sick. I'll never get all the sugar out of Aurum and Argentum's gearworks. Fine. Meg put the jelly bean jar back on the table, but not before grabbing one last fistful for herself and her canine accomplices. So we have to wait until the day after tomorrow. What do we do until then? Oh, we've got plenty to do, Frank promised. Planning, constructing defences, war games all day tomorrow. We have to run the Legion through every possible scenario. Besides, his voice faltered, as if he'd realised he was about to say something aloud that was best left in his head. His hand drifted towards the pouch where he held his firewood. I wondered if he'd taken any additional notes from Ella and Tyson, perhaps more harpy ramblings about bridges, fires and something. Something, if so, Frank apparently didn't want to share. Besides, he started again, you guys should rest up for the quest. You'll have to leave for Sutro early on Lester's birthday. Can we please not call it that? I pleaded. Also, who is you guys? Rayner asked. We may need another Senate vote to decide who goes on this quest. Nah, Frank said. I mean, we can check with the senators, but this is clearly an extension of the original mission, right? Besides, when we're at war, you and I have full executive power. Rayner regarded her colleague. Why, Frank Zhang, you've been studying the Praetor's Handbook. Maybe a little. Frank cleared his throat. Anyway, we know who needs to go to war. Apollo, Meg, and you. The doorway to the Soundless God has to be opened by Bellona's daughter, right? But Rayner looked back and forth between us. I can't just leave on the day for a major battle. Bellona's power is all about strength in numbers. I need to lead the troops. And you will, Frank promised, as soon as you get back from San Francisco. In the meantime, I'll hold the fort. I've got this. Rayner hesitated, but I thought I detected a gleam in her eye. Are you sure, Frank? I mean, yeah, of course you can do it. I know you can, but I'll be fine. Frank smiled like he meant it. Apollo and Meg need you on this quest. Go. Why did Rayner look so excited? How crushing her work must have been if after carrying the burden of leadership for so long, she was looking forward to going on an adventure across the bay to kill a god. I suppose, she said with an obviously feigned reluctance. It's settled then. Frank turned to Meg and me. You guys rest up. Big day tomorrow. We'll need your help with the war games. I've got a special job in mind for each of you. Chapter 20. Hamster Ball of Death. Spare me your fiery doom. I'm not feeling it. Oh boy, a special job. The anticipation was killing me, or maybe that was the poison in my veins. As soon as I returned to the coffee shop's attic, I crashed on my bed. Meg huffed. It's still light outside. You slept all day. Not turning into a zombie is hard work. I know, she snapped. I'm sorry. I looked up, surprised by her tone. Meg kicked an old paper latte cup across the room. She plopped onto her bed and glared at the floor. Meg? In her window box, irises grew with such speed that their flowers crackled open like corn kernels. Just a few minutes ago, Meg had been happily insulting me and gorging on jelly beans. Now, was she crying? Meg, I sat up, trying not to wince. Meg, you're not responsible for me getting hurt. She twisted the ring on her right hand, then the one on her left, as if they'd become too small for her fingers. I just thought, if I could kill him. She wiped her nose. Like in some stories, you kill the master and you can free the people he's turned. It took a moment for her words to sink in. I was pretty sure the dynamic she was describing applied to vampires, not zombies, but I understood what she meant. You're talking about Tarquin, I said. You jumped into the throne room because you wanted to save me. Duh, she muttered, without any heat. I put my hand over my bandaged abdomen. I'd been so angry with Meg for her recklessness in the tomb. I'd assumed she was just being impulsive, reacting to Tarquin's plans to let the Bay Area burn. But she leapt into battle for me, in the hope that she could kill Tarquin and raise my curse. That was even before I'd realised how bad my condition was. Meg must have been more worried or more intuitive than she'd let on, which certainly took all the fun out of criticising her. Oh, Meg, I shook my head. That was a crazy, senseless stunt, and I love you for it. But don't beat yourself up. Pranjal's medicine bought me some extra time, and if you did too, of course, with your cheese-grating skills and your magical chickweed, you've done everything you could. When we summon godly help, I can ask for complete healing. I'm sure I'll be as good as new, or at least as good as Lester can be. Meg tilted her head, making her crooked glasses just about horizontal. How can you know? Is this God going to give us free wishes or something? I considered that. When my followers called, had I ever shown up and granted them free wishes? Lol, nope. Maybe one wish, if that wish was something I wanted to happen anyway. And if this ritual only allowed me to call one God, who would it be? Assuming I could even choose. Perhaps my son, Asclepius, would be able to heal me, but he wouldn't feel very well fight the Roman Emperor's forces and the hordes of undead. Mars might grant us success on the battlefield, but he'd look at my wound and say something like, yeah, rough break, die bravely. Here I was with purple lines of infection snaking down my arms, telling Meg not to worry. I don't know, Meg, I confessed. You're right, I can't be sure everything will be okay, but I can promise you I'm not giving up. We've come this far. I'm not going to let a belly scratch stop us from defeating the triumvirate. She had so much mucus dripping from her nostrils, she would have made Buster the Unicorn proud. She sniffled, wiping her upper lip with her knuckle. I don't want to lose somebody else. My mental gears weren't turning at full speed. I had trouble wrapping my mind around the fact that by somebody else Meg meant me. I recalled one of her early memories, which I'd witnessed in my dreams. She'd been forced to gaze upon her father's lifeless body on the steps of Grand Central Station, while Nero, his murderer, hugged her and promised to take care of her. I remembered how she betrayed me to Nero in the Grove of Dodona out of fear of the beast, Nero's dark side, and how horrible she'd felt afterwards when we were reunited in Indianapolis. Then she'd taken all her displaced anger and guilt and frustration and projected it onto Caligula, which, to be honest, was a pretty good place to put it. Meg, being unable to lash out at Nero, had wanted so badly to kill Caligula. When Jason died instead, she was devastated. Now, aside from all the bad memories the Roman trappings of Camp Jupiter might have triggered for her, she was faced with the prospect of losing me, in a moment of shock, like a unicorn staring me right in the face. I realised that despite all the grief Meg gave me, and the way she ordered me around, she cared for me. For the past 3 months, I had been her one constant friend, just as she had been mine. The only other person who might have come close was Peaches, Meg's fruit tree spirit minion, and we hadn't seen him since Indianapolis. At first, I'd assumed Peaches was just being temperamental about when he decided to appear, like most supernatural creatures. But if he had tried to follow us to Palm Springs, where even the cacti struggled to survive, I didn't relish a peach tree's odds of survival there, much less in the burning maze. Meg hadn't mentioned Peaches to me once since we were in the labyrinth. Now I realised his absence must have been weighing on her, along with all her other worries. What a horrible, insufficient friend I had been. "Come here." I held out my arms. "Please." Meg hesitated, still sniffling. She rose from her bed and trudged towards me. She fell into my hug like I was a comfy mattress. I grunted, surprised by how solid and heavy she was. She smelled of apple peel and mud, but I didn't mind. I didn't even mind the mucus and tears soaking my shoulder. I'd always wondered what it would be like to have a younger sibling. Sometimes I'd treated Artemis as my baby sister, since I'd been born a few minutes earlier, but that had mostly been to annoy her. With Meg, I felt as if it were actually true. I had someone who depended on me, who needed me around, no matter how much we irritated each other. I thought about Hazel and Frank and the washing away of curses. I supposed that kind of love could come from many different types of relationships. "Okay." Meg pushed herself away, wiping her cheeks furiously. "Enough of that. You sleep. I'm going to get dinner or whatever." For a long time after she left, I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. Music floated up from the cafe, the soothing sounds of Horace Silver's piano, punctuated by the hiss of the espresso machine, accompanying Bon Billow singing in two-headed harmony. After spending a few days with these noises, I found them soothing, even homely. I drifted off to sleep, hoping to have warm, fuzzy dreams about Meg and me skipping through sunlit fields with our elephant, unicorn, and metal greyhound friends. Instead, I found myself back with the Emperors. On my list of places I least wanted to be, Caligula's yacht ranked right up there with Tarquin's tomb, the eternal abyss of chaos, and the Limburger cheese factory in Liège, Belgium, where stinking gym socks went to feel better about themselves. Commodus lounged in a deck chair, an aluminium tanning bib around his neck reflecting the afternoon sun directly into his face. Sunglasses covered his scarred eyes. He wore only pink swimming trunks and pink Crocs. I took absolutely no notice of the way the tanning oil glistened on his muscular bronzed body. Caligula stood nearby in his captain's uniform, white coat, dark slacks and striped shirt, all crisply pressed. His cruel face looked almost angelic as he marvelled at the contraption that now took up the entire aft deck. The artillery mortar was the size of an above-ground swimming pool, with a 2-foot-thick rim of dark iron and a diameter wide enough to drive a car through. Nestled in the barrel, a massive green sphere glowed like a giant radioactive hamster ball. Pandai rushed around the deck, blanket ears flopping, their furry hands moving at preternatural speeds as they plugged in cables and oiled gears at the base of the weapon. Some of the Pandai were young enough to have pure white fur, which made my heart hurt, reminding me of my brief friendship with Crest, the youthful aspiring musician who'd lost his life in the burning maze. "It's wonderful," Caligula beamed, circling the mortar. "Is it ready for test firing?" "Yes, Lord," said the Pandos boost. "Of course, every sphere of Greek fire is very, very expensive, so—" "Do it," Caligula yelled. Boost yelped and scrambled to the control panel. Greek fire. I hated the stuff, and I was a sun god who rode a fiery chariot. Vicious, green, and impossible to extinguish. Greek fire was just plain nasty. A cupful could burn down an entire building, and that single glowing sphere held more than I'd ever seen in one place. "Oh, Commodus," Caligula called. "You might want to pay attention to this." "I am fully attentive," Commodus said, turning his face to better catch the sun. Caligula sighed. "Boost, you may proceed." Boost called out instructions in his own language. His fellow Pandai turned cranks and spun dials, slowly swivelling the mortar until it pointed out to sea. Boost double-checked his readings on the control panel, then shouted, "Unas, duo, tres!" With a mighty boom, the mortar fired. The entire boat shuddered from the recoil. The giant hamster ball rocketed upward until it was a green marble in the sky, then plummeted towards the western horizon. The sky blazed emerald. A moment later, hot winds buffeted the ship with the smell of burning salt and cooked fish. In the distance, a geyser of green fire churned on the boiling sea. "Ooh, pretty," Caligula grinned at Boost. "And you have one missile for each ship?" "Yes, Lord, as instructed." "The range?" "Once we clear Treasure Island, we'll be able to bring all weapons to bear on Camp Jupiter, my lord. No magical defences can stop such a massive volley. Total annihilation." "Good," Caligula said. "That's my favourite kind." "But remember," Commodus called from his deck chair, having not even turned to watch the explosion. "First, we try a ground assault. Maybe they'll be wise and surrender. We want New Rome intact, and the Harpy and Cyclops taken alive if possible." "Yes, yes," Caligula said, "if possible." He seemed to savour those words like a beautiful lie. His eyes glittered in the green artificial sunset. Either way, this will be fun. I woke up alone, the sun baking my face. For a second I thought I might be in a deck chair next to Commodus, a tanning bib around my neck. But no, the days when Commodus and I hung out together were long gone. I sat up, groggy, disorientated and dehydrated. Why was it still light outside? Then I realised, judging from the angle of the sun coming into the room, that it must have been about noon. Once again I'd slept through the night and half a day. I still felt exhausted. I pressed gently on my bandaged gut. I was horrified to find the wound tender again. The purple lines of infection had darkened. This could only mean one thing. It was time for a long-sleeve shirt. No matter what happened over the next 24 hours, I would not add to Meg's worries. I would tough it out until the moment I keeled over. Wow, who even was I? By the time I'd changed my clothes and hobbled out of Bombillo's coffee shop, most of the Legion had gathered at the mess hall for lunch. As usual, the dining room bustled with activity. Demigods, grouped by cohorts, reclined on couches around low tables, while Ore whisked overhead with platters of food and pitchers of drink. Hanging from the cedar rafters, war game pennants and cohort standards rippled in the constant breeze. When they'd finished eating, diners rose cautiously and walked away hunched over, lest they get decapitated by a flying plate of cold cuts. Except for the Lairs, of course. They didn't care what sort of delicacies flew through their ectoplasmic noggins. I spotted Frank at the officers' table, deep in conversation with Hazel and the rest of the Centurions. Raina was nowhere in sight. Perhaps she was taking a nap or preparing for the afternoon's war drills. Given what we were facing tomorrow, Frank looked remarkably relaxed. As he chatted with his officers, he even cracked a smile, which seemed to put the others at ease. How simple it would be to destroy their fragile confidence, I thought, just by describing the flotilla of artillery yachts I'd seen in my dream. Not yet, I decided. No sense in spoiling their meal. "Hey, Lester!" Lavinia yelled from across the room, waving me over as if I were her waiter. I joined her and Meg at the 5th cohort table. An Aura deposited a goblet of water in my hand, then left a whole pitcher on the table. Apparently my dehydration was that obvious. Lavinia leaned forward, her eyebrows arched like pink and chestnut rainbows. "So is it true?" I frowned at Meg, wondering which of the many embarrassing stories about me she might have shared. She was too busy ploughing through a row of hot dogs to pay me any mind. "Is what true?" I asked. "The shoes." "Shoes?" Lavinia threw her hands in the air. "The dancing shoes of Terpsichore. Meg was telling us what happened on Caligula's yachts. She said you and that Piper girl saw a pair of Terpsichore's shoes." "Oh, I'd completely forgotten about those, or the fact that I'd told Meg about them. Strange, but the other events aboard Caligula's ships, getting captured, seeing Jason killed before our eyes, barely escaping with our lives, had eclipsed my memories of the Emperor's footwear collection." "Meg," I said, "of all the things you could have chosen to tell them, you told them about that." "Wasn't my idea." Meg somehow managed to enunciate with half a hot dog in her mouth. "Lavinia likes shoes." "Well, what did you think I was going to ask about?" Lavinia demanded. "You tell me the Emperor has an entire boatload of shoes. Of course I'm going to wonder if you saw any dancing ones. So it's true then, Lester?" "I mean, yes, we saw a pair of—" "Wow." Lavinia sat back, crossed her arms and glared at me. "Just wow. You wait until now to tell me this? Do you know how rare those shoes are? How important?" She seemed to choke on her own indignation. "Wow." Around the table, Lavinia's comrades showed a mixture of reactions. Some rolled their eyes, some smirked, some kept eating as if nothing Lavinia did could surprise them any more. An older boy with shaggy brown hair dared to stick up for me. "Lavinia, Apollo has had a few other things going on?" "Oh my gods, Thomas," Lavinia shot back. "Naturally you wouldn't understand. You never take off those boots." Thomas frowned at his standard-issue combat stompers. "What? They've got good arch support." "Yeesh." Lavinia turned to Meg. "We have to figure out a way to get aboard that ship and rescue those shoes." "Nah." Meg sucked a glob of relish off her thumb. "Way too dangerous." "But," "Lavinia," I interrupted, "you can't." She must have heard the fear and urgency in my voice. Over the past few days I had developed a strange fondness for Lavinia. I didn't want to see her charge into a slaughter, especially after my dream about those mortars primed with Greek fire. She ran her Star of David pendant back and forth on its chain. "You got new information?" "Dish." Before I could reply, a plate of food flew into my hands. The Ore had decided I needed chicken nuggets and fries. Lots of them. Either that or they'd heard the word dish and taken it as an order. A moment later, Hazel and the other 5th Cohort Centurion joined us, a dark-haired young man with a strange red stain around his mouth. "Ah yes, Dakota, child of Bacchus." "What's going on?" Dakota asked. "Lester has news." Lavinia stared at me expectantly, as if I might be withholding the location of Terpishaw's magical tutu, which, for the record, I hadn't seen in centuries. I took a deep breath. I wasn't sure if this was the right forum for sharing my dream. I should probably report it to the praetors first. But Hazel nodded at me as if to say, "Go on." I decided that was good enough. I described what I'd seen, a top-of-the-range IKEA heavy mortar, fully assembled, shooting a giant hamster ball of green flaming death that blew up the Pacific Ocean. I explained that apparently the Emperors had 50 such mortars. On each ship there was one, which would be ready to obliterate Camp Jupiter as soon as they took up positions in the bay. Dakota's face turned as red as his mouth. "I need more fruit punch." The fact that no goblets flew into his hand told me the Ore disagreed. Lavinia looked like she'd been slapped with one of her mother's ballet slippers. Meg kept eating hot dogs as if they might be the last ones she'd ever get. Hazel chewed her bottom lip in concentration, perhaps trying to extract any good news from what I'd said. She seemed to find this harder than pulling diamonds out of the ground. "Okay, look guys, we knew the Emperors were assembling secret weapons. At least now we know what these weapons are. I'll convey this information to the praetors, but it doesn't change anything. You all did a great job in the morning drills." She hesitated, then generously decided not to add, except for Apollo, who slept through it all. "And this afternoon, one of our war games will be about boarding enemy ships. We can get prepared." From the expressions around the table, I gathered the 5th Cohort was not reassured. The Romans had never been known for their naval prowess. Last I checked, the Camp Jupiter Navy consisted of some old triremes they only used for mock naval battles in the Colosseum, and one rowing boat they kept docked in Alameda. Drilling to board enemy ships would be less about practicing a workable battle plan and more about keeping the legionnaires busy so they wouldn't think about their impending doom. Thomas rubbed his forehead. "I hate my life." "Keep it together, legionnaire," Hazel said. "This is what we signed up for, defending the legacy of Rome." "From its own emperors," Thomas said miserably. "I'm sorry to tell you," I put in, "but the biggest threat to the empire was often its own emperors." Nobody argued. At the officers' table, Frank Zhang stood. All around the room, flying pitchers and platters froze in mid-air, waiting respectfully. "Legionnaires," Frank announced, managing a confident smile. "Relay activities will recommence on the field of Mars in 20 minutes. Drill like your lives depend on it. Because they do." Chapter 21. See this right here, kids? This is how you don't do it. Questions? Class dismissed. "How's the wound?" Hazel asked. I knew she meant well, but I was getting very tired of that question, and even more tired of the wound. We walked side by side out of the main gates, heading for the field of Mars. Just ahead of us, Meg cartwheeled down the road, though how she did this without regurgitating the 4 hot dogs she'd eaten, I had no idea. "Oh, you know," I said, in a terrible attempt to sound upbeat. "All things considered, I'm okay." My old immortal self would have laughed at that. Okay? Are you joking? Over the last few months I had drastically scaled back my expectations. At this point, okay meant still able to walk and breathe. "I should have realised earlier," Hazel said. "Your death aura is getting stronger by the hour." "Can we not talk about my death aura?" "Sorry, it's just, I wish Nico were here. He might know how to fix you." I wouldn't have minded seeing Hazel's half-brother, Nico D'Angelo, son of Hades, had been quite valuable when we fought Nero at Camp Half-Blood. And of course his boyfriend, my son, Will Solis, was an excellent healer. Yet I suspected they wouldn't be able to help me any more than Pranjal had. If Will and Nico were here, they would just be 2 more people for me to worry about, 2 more loved ones watching me with concern, wondering how long until I went full-on zombie. "I appreciate the sentiment," I said, "but what is Lavinia doing?" About 100 yards away, Lavinia and Don the Fawn stood on a bridge across the little Tiber, which was very much not on the way to the Field of Mars, having what looked like a serious argument. Perhaps I shouldn't have brought this to Hazel's attention. Then again, if Lavinia wanted to go unnoticed, she should have chosen a different hair colour, like camouflage for instance, and not waved her arms around so much. I don't know. Hazel's expression reminded me of a tired mother who had found her toddler trying to climb into the monkey enclosure for the dozenth time. Lavinia? Lavinia looked over. She patted the air as if to say, just give me a minute, then went back to arguing with Don. Am I too young to get ulcers? Hazel wondered aloud. I had little occasion for humour, given all that was happening, but that comment made me laugh. As we got closer to the Field of Mars, I saw legionnaires breaking into cohorts, moving 2 different activities spreading across the wasteland. One group was digging defensive trenches. Another had gathered on the shore of an artificial lake that hadn't been there yesterday, waiting to board 2 makeshift boats that looked nothing like Caligula's yachts. A third group sledged down a dirt hill on their shields. Hazel sighed. That would be my group of delinquents. If you'll excuse me, I'm off to teach them how to slay ghouls. She jogged away, leaving me alone with my cartwheeling sidekick. So, where do we go? I asked Meg. Frank said we had special jobs. Yup. Meg pointed to the far end of the field, where the 5th cohort was waiting at a target range. You're teaching archery. I stared at her. I'm doing what now? Frank taught the morning class since you slept forever. Now it's your turn. But I can't teach as Lester, especially in my condition. Besides, Romans never rely on archery in combat. They think projectile weapons are beneath them. Gotta think in new ways if you want to beat the emperors, Meg said. Like me, I'm weaponizing the unicorns. Wait, what? Later. Meg skipped across the field towards a large riding ring, where the 1st cohort and a herd of unicorns were staring suspiciously at one another. I couldn't imagine how Meg planned to weaponize the non-violent creatures, or who had given her permission to try, but I had a sudden horrible image of Romans and unicorns assaulting one another with large cheese graters. I decided to mind my own business. With a sigh, I turned towards the firing range and went to meet my new pupils. The only thing scarier than being bad at archery was discovering that I was suddenly good at it again. That may not sound like a problem, but since becoming mortal I'd experienced a few random bursts of godly skill. Each time my powers had quickly evaporated again, leaving me much bitter and disillusioned than ever. Sure, I may have fired a quiver full of amazing shots in Tarquin's tomb. That didn't mean I could do it again. If I tried to demonstrate proper shooting techniques in front of a whole cohort and ended up hitting one of Meg's unicorns in the butt, I would die of embarrassment long before the zombie poison got me. Okay, everyone, I said. I suppose we can start. Dakota was rummaging through his water-stained quiver, trying to find an arrow that wasn't warped. Apparently he thought it was a great idea to store his archery supplies in the sauna. Thomas and another legionnaire, Marcus, were sword-fighting with their bows. Their legion standard-bearer Jacob was drawing his bow with the butt of the arrow directly at eye level, which explained why his left eye was covered in a patch from the morning's lessons. He now seemed eager to blind himself completely. Come on, guys, said Lavinia. She had sneaked in late without being noticed, one of her superpowers, and took it upon herself to help me call the troops to order. Apollo might know stuff. This was how I knew I'd hit rock bottom. The highest praise I could receive from a mortal was that I might know stuff. I cleared my throat. I'd faced much bigger audiences. Why was I so nervous? Oh, right, because I was a horribly incompetent 16-year-old. So, let's talk about how to aim. My voice cracked, naturally. Wide stance, full draw, then find your target with your dominant eye, or in Jacob's case, with your one working eye. Aim along your sight pin, if you have one. I don't have a sight pin, said Marcus. It's the little circle thingy right there, Lavinia showed him. I have a sight pin, Marcus corrected himself. Then you let fly, I said, like this. I shot at the nearest target, then at the target next furthest out, then at the next, firing again and again in a kind of trance. Only after my 20th shot did I realise I'd hit every bullseye, 2 in each target, the furthest about 200 yards away. Child's play for Apollo. For Lester, quite impossible. The legionnaires stared at me, their mouths hanging open. We're supposed to do that, Dakota demanded. Lavinia punched my forearm. See you guys? Told you Apollo doesn't suck that much. Had to agree with her. I felt oddly not suckish. The display of marksmanship hadn't drained my energy, nor did it feel like the temporary bursts of godly power I'd experienced before. I was tempted to ask for another quiver to see if I could keep shooting at the same skill level, but I was afraid to press my luck. So, I faltered, I don't expect you to be that good right away. I was only demonstrating what's possible with a lot of practice. Let's give it a try, shall we? I was relieved to take the focus off myself. I organised the cohort into a firing line and made my way down the ranks, offering advice. Despite his warped arrows, Dakota was not terrible. He actually hit the target a few times. Jacob managed not to blind himself in the other eye. Thomas and Marcus sent most of their arrows skittering across the earth, ricocheting off rocks and into the trenches, with elicited shouts of "Hey, watch it!" from the ditch-digging 4th cohort. After an hour of frustration with a regular bow, Lavinia gave up and pulled out her manuballista. Her first bolt knocked down the 50-yard target. "Why do you insist on using that slow-loading monstrosity?" I asked. "If you're so ADHD, wouldn't a regular bow give you more instant satisfaction?" Lavinia shrugged. "Maybe, but the manuballista makes a statement. Speaking of which," she leaned towards me, her expression turning serious. "I need to talk to you." "That doesn't sound good." "No, it's not. In the distance, a horn blew. "Okay, guys," Dakota called. "Time to rotate activities. Good team effort." Lavinia punched me in the arm again. "Later, Lester." The 5th cohort dropped their weapons and ran towards the next activity, leaving me to retrieve all their arrows. Cretins. The rest of the afternoon I stayed at the firing range, working with each cohort in turn. As the hours wore on, both the shooting and the teaching became less intimidating for me. By the time I was wrapping up work with my last group, the 1st cohort, I was convinced that my improved archery skills were here to stay. I didn't know why. I still couldn't shoot at my old godly level, but I was definitely better now than the average demigod archer or Olympic gold medalist. I had started to jive. I considered pulling out the arrow of Dodona to brag, see what I can do, but I didn't want to jinx myself. Besides, knowing that I was dying of zombie poison on the eve of a major battle took some of the thrill out of being able to shoot bullseyes again. The Romans were duly impressed. Some of them even learned a little, like how to fire an arrow without blinding yourself or killing the guy next to you. Still, I could tell they were more excited about the other activities they'd done. I overheard a lot of whispering about unicorns and Hazel's super secret ghoul fighting techniques. Larry from the 3rd cohort had enjoyed boarding ships so much he declared that he wanted to be a pirate when he grew up. I suspected most of the Legionnaires had even enjoyed ditch digging more than my class. It was late evening when the final horn blew and the cohorts tromped back to camp. I was hungry and exhausted. I wondered if this was how mortal teachers felt after a full day of classes. If so, I didn't see how they managed. I hope they were richly compensated with gold, diamonds and rare spices. At least the cohorts seemed to be in an upbeat mood. If the praetor's goal had been to take the troops' minds off their fears and raise morale on the eve of battle, then our afternoon had been a success. If the goal had been to train the legion to successfully repel our enemies, then I was less than hopeful. Also, all day long, everyone had carefully avoided addressing the worst thing about tomorrow's attack. The Romans would have to face their former comrades, returned as zombies under Tarquin's control. I remembered how hard it had been for Lavinia to shoot down Bobby with her crossbow in the tomb. I wondered how the Legion's morale would hold up once they faced the same ethical dilemma times 50 or 60. I was turning into the Via Principalis, on my way to the mess hall, when a voice said, "Psst." Lurking in the alley between Bombelo's cafe and the chariot repair shop was Lavinia and Don. The former was wearing an honest-to-God's trench coat over his tie-dyed T-shirt, as if that made him look inconspicuous. Lavinia wore a black cap over her pink hair. "Come here," she hissed. "But dinner. We need you. Is this a mugging?" She marched over, grabbed my arm and pulled me into the shadows. "Don't worry, dude," Don told me. "It's not a mugging. But, if you do have any spare change." "Shut up, Don," said Lavinia. "I'll shut up," Don agreed. "Lester," Lavinia said, "you need to come with us." "Lavinia, I'm tired. I'm hungry. And I have no spare change. Can't it please wait?" "No, because tomorrow we might all die, and this is important. We're sneaking out." "Sneaking out?" "Yeah," Don said. "It's when you're sneaking and you go out." "Why?" I demanded. "You'll see." Lavinia's tone was ominous, as if she couldn't explain what my coffin looked like. I had to admire it with my own eyes. "What if we get caught?" "Oh," Don perked up. "I know this one. For a first offence, it's latrine duty for a month. But see, if we all die tomorrow, it won't matter." With that happy news, Lavinia and Don grabbed my hands and dragged me further into the darkness.